the night Serena's father walked into that courtroom. The man who had destroyed his daughter's life finally understood what it meant to face someone who had nothing left to lose. But to understand why Raymond Osei stood at that plaintiff's table with the calm of a man who had already won, you have to go back to the beginning. To a Tuesday morning in November, to a kitchen in Mississauga, to a woman named Serena who was still, somehow, making her husband's coffee. Serena Osei was 31 years old and had spent the last 4 years building something she believed in completely. A marriage, a home, a life with a man named Calloway. Tall, charming, the kind of man who knew how to walk into a room and make everyone feel like they'd been waiting for him. They'd met at a fundraiser for St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, where Serena worked as a pediatric nurse, and Calloway was a corporate lawyer with a firm downtown. He'd said she was the most self-possessed woman he'd ever met. She'd laughed and told him he needed to get out more. They got married in Muskoka on a July evening when the lake was flat and the sky went 3 colors at once. Her father cried. Her mother danced until her shoes gave out. It was the kind of wedding people talked about for years afterward, and Serena believed, truly, completely believed, that she had built something solid. She did not know, on that Tuesday morning in November, that 3 kilometers away, in a hotel suite at the Ritz-Carlton on Wellington Street, her husband was lying in bed with a woman named Petra Hadley. She did not know that this had been happening for 11 months. She did not know that Calloway had used their joint account to pay for a weekend in Montreal, a bracelet from a shop in Yorkville, 2 dinners at a restaurant on King Street where the tasting menu cost more than Serena made in a shift. She did not know any of this. What she knew was that her son, their son Mateo, who had just turned 4 years old and was obsessed with trains and absolutely terrified of bees, had woken up that morning with hives spreading fast across his neck and arms. She knew that he was wheezing. She knew from her training exactly what that wheezing meant. She called Calloway 4 times. The phone rang and went to voicemail each time. She called his office. His assistant said he hadn't come in yet. She called again. Voicemail. She sent a text that said, "Please pick up. Mateo is having a reaction. I need you right now." The message showed delivered. It was not read. Serena picked up her son, buckled him into his car seat with hands she was forcing to stay steady, and drove to Credit Valley Hospital in Mississauga in 9 minutes flat. She talked to Mateo the whole way. She told him about the big train set they were going to build at Christmas. She told him his favorite story about the engine that got lost in a snowstorm and found its way home by following the sound of bells. She kept her eyes on the road and she kept her voice even, and inside she was unraveling thread by thread. The doctors met them at the entrance. Mateo went into anaphylactic shock 20 minutes after they arrived. The team worked on him for 47 minutes. Serena stood in a hallway outside and she prayed in a way she hadn't since she was a child. Not formal, not structured, just the raw repetition of please, please, please until the word lost its shape. At 11:43 in the morning, a doctor named Singh came through the door and his face told her everything before he opened his mouth. Mateo was gone. She called Calloway 6 more times before she reached him. He answered on the 7th call with the irritated voice of a man who had been interrupted. She could hear, faintly in the background, a woman laughing. When she told him, there was a silence so long she thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "I'm coming." He arrived at the hospital an hour and 12 minutes later. His collar was crooked. There was a faint smell of a perfume that was not Serena's. She was sitting in a plastic chair in a waiting room, and she looked up at him and she said nothing, because there was nothing left in her that could produce language. His phone had been off. His phone had been deliberately switched off. The hotel had a policy about guest privacy, and Calloway had used it like a shield, and while he was using it like a shield, his 4-year-old son had died of an allergic reaction in a hospital 40 minutes away. The grief that came for Serena in the days that followed was not the kind that arrives all at once. It came in pieces, at strange times. When she went to move his jacket from the hook by the door and found a small wooden train in the pocket. When she heard a child laugh in a grocery store and turned around before she could stop herself. When she woke at 3 in the morning and for exactly 1/2 second forgot, and then remembered. She did not tell anyone about the voicemails right away. She did not tell anyone what she'd heard in the background when Calloway finally picked up. She was a woman who had just lost her child and she was moving through days that felt like wading through concrete, and she could only carry so much. It was her father who found out. Raymond Osei was 64 years old, born in Accra, and had spent 35 years in Canada building a property development company that now had projects in 6 provinces. He was a man who believed deeply in 3 things: his family, his faith, and the idea that how you treat people follows you. He had seen men ruin themselves through cruelty. He had watched it happen slowly and he had watched it happen fast. He drove to Mississauga the night after Mateo's funeral. He sat across from his daughter at her kitchen table and he listened. Not just to what she said but to what she couldn't say. He watched her hands. He watched how she flinched when she heard Calloway's car in the driveway. He watched how she made herself smaller every time her husband entered a room. Raymond was not a man who made decisions in anger. That was important. What he did next was not anger. It was something colder and more deliberate. He hired an investigator named Thornton, not through the firm he used for business, but privately, through a lawyer he trusted in Ottawa. He wanted to know everything, and within 3 weeks, he knew it. 11 months of the Ritz-Carlton, of weekend trips, of a bracelet, of dinners, of a woman named Petra Hadley, who worked in Calloway's firm and had been answering his calls even when his wife could not reach him. Raymond also discovered something else. Calloway had known about Mateo's peanut allergy. It was documented. It was serious. It had been discussed extensively with their family doctor. And Calloway had signed the form at Mateo's daycare. He knew. He had simply chosen on that particular morning to keep his phone off. Raymond did not confront Calloway. He did not call him. He did not show up at the firm. He sat with what he knew and he made a plan the way he had always made plans. Carefully, without waste, without theater. The first thing he did was call his lawyers. Serena filed for divorce on a Wednesday morning in January. Calloway did not see it coming, which said something about the degree to which he had stopped paying attention to his wife. The papers arrived at his office. His assistant brought them in on a Tuesday afternoon, and he sat there for a long time looking at them, like they were written in a language he didn't quite speak. His lawyer called Raymond's lawyers and suggested a quiet settlement. Raymond's lawyers declined. What came next took 6 months, and it was not quiet. Calloway had been careful but not careful enough. The hotel receipts existed. The text messages existed. Not to Serena, but between Calloway and Petra, saved on a phone that Petra, who by February had been informed exactly who Raymond O.C. was and what he was capable of, had handed over to her own lawyer in an attempt to distance herself from what was becoming a very public disaster. The civil suit was not about the money. Raymond had money. The suit was about accountability, and specifically, about the question of whether Calloway's deliberate decision to switch off his phone and make himself unreachable on a morning, when his child had a documented life-threatening allergy, constituted negligence. It was a complicated legal question. It became significantly less complicated when Thornton produced the hotel check-in records, the phone logs, and the testimony of the hotel concierge, who confirmed that Mr. Calloway had requested that the room not be disturbed and had explicitly stated that he did not wish to receive outside calls. Serena sat in the courtroom on the day of the hearing and she looked straight ahead. She had lost weight she hadn't intended to lose. She had dark circles she covered with the automatic habit of someone who had been getting up for 12-hour shifts while grieving. She was 31 years old and she looked like someone who had lived a decade inside the last 4 months. Her father sat beside her. Raymond O.C., in a dark suit, with his hands folded on the table in front of him, looked exactly like what he was. A man who had waited a very long time for this moment and was going to be absolutely present for every second of it. Calloway's legal team was good. They were expensive and experienced and they had a strategy, which involved emphasizing the tragedy of Mateo's death as something no one could have predicted and steering attention away from the phone logs. They referred to Calloway's grief. They used the word devastated 11 times, which someone was counting. The judge's name was the Honorable Patricia Ochterberg, and she had been on the bench in Ontario for 19 years. She had seen a great many things. She listened to both sides without expression, took her notes, and asked several questions that made Calloway's legal team visibly uncomfortable. The judgment took 3 weeks. When it came, it addressed several points. It addressed the question of negligence, and found that while criminal liability was a matter for a separate proceeding, the civil standard had been met. It addressed the question of the phone. It addressed the conduct of a married man with a dependent child who had made the deliberate choice to be unreachable on a morning when his family might need him. It was not gentle. Calloway was ordered to pay into a trust in Mateo's name. Raymond's lawyers had suggested this, a fund that would go to pediatric anaphylaxis research at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. The number attached to it was significant. Calloway's firm, which had spent 6 months quietly hoping the whole matter would resolve itself, let him go 2 weeks after the judgment came down. The story had been covered by 2 Toronto news outlets and 1 national one, and his name had a quality now that made clients uncomfortable. Petra Hadley had, months earlier, resigned from the firm and moved to Calgary. She had not been a party to the civil suit, but she had been named in the divorce proceedings, and her name had become something she was trying to put distance between herself and. The bracelet, it was noted in the proceedings, had been purchased on the same day that Serena had taken Mateo to his allergy appointment. Calloway did not go to prison. That is the truth, and it is worth saying plainly, because what happened to him was not a Hollywood ending. He did not end up in a cell. He ended up in a way that was, in some respects, harder. He ended up visible. He ended up known. He ended up the man whose phone was off when his son was dying. And that was a thing that would follow him in every professional introduction, every handshake, every room he walked into for the rest of his working life. His license was intact, but his reputation was not. And in his profession those two things were impossible to separate. His marriage to Serena was dissolved in April. She kept the house in Mississauga and sold it 3 months later because she could not sleep in it anymore. She moved to a flat in the Annex in Toronto, near a park where she could walk without being reminded of anything specific. She took a leave from the hospital. She came back to it in September, slowly, one shift at a time, in a different unit at first, because the pediatric floor was more than she could carry yet. Her colleagues were careful with her. They brought her coffee. They did not make her explain herself. Her father called every evening at 7 o'clock. Not always to talk. Sometimes just to check that she was there, that the phone was answered, that someone on the other end said her name. There is a thing that happens to women who go through what Serena went through. A particular kind of doubt that has nothing to do with what's logical and everything to do with grief. The question of whether you could have done something differently, whether you should have driven faster, called someone else, gotten there earlier. Serena knew, professionally, that she had done everything right. She had gotten Mateo to the hospital in time for the doctors to try. She knew that, but knowing a thing and being free of it are not the same. What she said months later, when a friend asked her how she was really doing, was this. Some days I wake up and I'm just so angry I can't breathe. And then some days I wake up and I'm just tired. And I'm learning that both of those things are okay. Raymond heard this secondhand and he said nothing. But the expression on his face was one that people who knew him well would recognize. The look of a man measuring what he had done against what it had cost, finding the calculation painful and necessary all at once. The fund in Mateo's name began accepting donations in November. Exactly 1 year after that Tuesday morning in Mississauga, the Hospital for Sick Children posted a small announcement on their website. It noted that the fund had been established by the child's family and would support research into pediatric allergic reactions and emergency response protocols. It did not mention Calloway. It did not need to. Serena went to the hospital that day and asked to see where the research team worked. They showed her a lab and a conference room and introduced her to a doctor, who spoke about what they were trying to understand. Why some reactions escalated so fast, what the indicators were, what could be done in the minutes before treatment. She listened the way she listened to everything now, completely, with her whole body, not taking anything for granted. Before she left, she stood in a corridor for a moment, looking at a bulletin board full of photographs. Children, most of them, smiling in the particular unguarded way that children smile when they're not thinking about the camera. She looked at them for a long time. Then she put on her coat, and she went out into the November cold. And the city went on around her the way cities do. Indifferent and enormous and full of people carrying their own weight. And she walked to her car and she drove home. Her father called at 7 o'clock. She answered on the first ring.